Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of Ink to Table, a supplemental podcast to our digital indie comics magazine. This is Curtis Clow.
And Caleb Palmquist. What are you?
I can cut that. And Ink to Table is a digital indie comics magazine where each month we do a deep dive into quality comic, a single quality comic that we think is good on Kickstarter.
And then every month we also release a companion podcast where Curtis and I stumble through an interview with the creator of that comic book. This month we talked to Ray Chou, the creator of Sansha and Blanco, and we talked to him all about his comic that's currently on Kickstarter, his history on Kickstarter, his RPGs that he's been very successful with his company MythWorks, and we really got into all that stuff. It was a very deep dive conversation. We had a lot of fun, and he had a lot of insights to share, so we hope you enjoy this month's interview.
Yeah, and we also have Kickstarters live of our own for a couple more days each, I believe. Yours is, what, 3 days? 2 days?
2 days left.
Mine's about 6 days. It'll be done February 24th. New comic series, A Place Where Time Doesn't Exist. Caleb, what do you got?
I have a reprint crossover cover of some of my comic books, including Unicorn and Vampire Hunter. But as always, if you're interested in the comics that we're doing, you can check out the link on our Substack or in the description, the show notes. And we'll have a link that's pointing to whatever we've got live right now, whether it's the ones we just talked about, or if you're listening to this in the distant future, whatever we're kickstarting.
Yeah, then. Caleb launches a Kickstarter every week, so if you're listening to this in the near future, he'll have something else live right now. So
it's possible if you're listening to this, Curtis will have nothing live because he's taking another year-long break.
Very true. But the main point of this is to promote the comic that we featured this month, which is a great comic. Like we said, Sansha and Blanco. Really loved issue 1, and the rest of the podcast, you'll hear us talk to Ray about it. And be sure to subscribe to the Substack to get all of the future releases.
Yep. So without any further ado, let's dive into the interview with Ray.
Fantastic. This is episode 2 of Ink to Table, the companion podcast to our Kickstarter Substack indie magazine, I guess you could call it. We're with Ray. I actually don't even know how to say your last name.
It's Chou.
Ray Chou.
Yeah.
The creator of Sansha and Blanco, and one of the head guys at MythWorks, somebody I've looked up to and became a friend with. You've been on Kickstarter for a couple years before me. When was your first Kickstarter?
2014, I think.
Was that Skies of Fire one?
Skies of Fire #1, March 2014. Yeah.
And now you're live with Sansha and Blanco, your third comic series, issue 2. And you've done a ton of Kickstarter since then. You've done RPGs, comics, ton of experience on Kickstarter, self-publishing and publishing board games and whatnot. How's everything going with Sansha and Blanco now?
Yeah, Sansha Blanco is doing pretty good. It's obviously not as explosive or as large as our previous comic campaigns, but I think there's a couple of good reasons for that. It's doing about as well as the first issue, so I can't really complain. I was hoping to grow it a little bit from the backers for the numbers from the first issue, but it seems like we're pretty much being on par with that, and that's all right. The most important thing for me, because I funded the production, meaning the art and lettering and coloring of Sansha and Blanco kind of privately for the last couple of years. So all that's taken care of. We don't need money to do that. We just need money to print the book, and that's the most important thing, just getting it out there to people. And hopefully once we have the comics in hand, we can build a bigger audience that way.
Right. I mean, you're like one of the biggest indie creators on Kickstarter with the Skies of Fire. I think it was volumes 1 and 2 collected edition hitting like something crazy. It was like 170K or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like was for the comic category because my numbers haven't really been.
What year was that? For the
that
volumes?
was for volumes 1 and 2, that was I think 2022. I want to say 2022. So a couple of years ago now, 3 years ago, and we haven't done another Skies of Fire since. We're working on sort of series 2, but that's a long gesticulating project, and my really since then, or right as that was happening, my time is kind of taken up by the tabletop role-playing side of things. So we've had pretty big campaigns on that side of crowdfunding, but as a result, I feel that the comic side for us has kind of been neglected a little bit the past couple of years, and that's something I'm trying to change in a big way this year. And it's there's only so much you can do as for one person, right? And it's kind of difficult juggling between different projects, but trying to find a way to do it. And I'm actually really excited to kind of pick Caleb's brain, because I see him launching a new project like every month basically, and I think that's pretty incredible, and really kind of like the new wave of crowdfunding comics that seems to be the trend.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, because I've obviously watched your Kickstarter career for a long time, and you had some really big hits, and then because you like you said, you went over to the RPG stuff, you slowed down a bit, but now it seems like you're trying to pick up the pace again, especially with the comics. I mean, I see what you're doing with launching Sansha Blanco, and I know you worked way far in advance on this series. That's my understanding, right? Like, you did the whole thing, and so. I mean, I guess, are you hoping to continue that pace after Sansha Blanco finishes? Because, I mean, I'm happy to talk about my projects and stuff, but obviously we're here talking about your stuff, and do you see yourself continuing that pace with other projects after this one finishes?
To a certain extent. I don't know if I can sustain it the way that you have, where it seems you're launching a new project every month, basically, right? Or like every 2 months or so. Is it like?
It's always my intention to launch every month. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So, so you probably have like what 4 or 5 series cooking, and like a lead time of like, I'm guessing 3 or 4 issues at the very least.
No. You're overestimating me. I have. The biggest lead time I have on anything is like 1.5 issues. I just have, because I mean, finances is a thing, right? Like I think that you are clearly you must have been in a good position to get this one ready ahead of time, or either in a good position or taking a risk is my assumption. I don't know exactly how you managed it, but every time I work ahead, which I do, I'm taking a risk. I'm taking a financial risk, frankly. I mean, almost everything I do now is either complete or nearly complete when I do the Kickstarter. And so I was just talking to Curtis before you got on that my latest comic just arrived that I did back in November. The 3rd issue of my Dragon Western series just arrived. And so I'm going to start getting that shipped out. But, it's, I mean, every time that you do something, like, I'm sure when you were doing Sansha Blanco ahead of time, you were hoping that it would hit more numbers like Skies of Fire did, or something closer to that. And so, you just never know, especially with something brand new. It's like super scary to do. And so that's why, I mean, you see, I heard you talking about Skies of Fire, and that's something I wanted to ask you about, if you were going to return to that, because I think a lot of creators, if you look at Kickstarter, a lot of creators that are having a lot of success really stick to the thing that they're good at, like that series that they're good at. And Sansha is such a huge departure for you. I mean, it's unlike anything you've done before.
Yeah. So to circle back to the original question in terms of lead time, so obviously we have Sansha and Blanco, which is 4 issues total, and we have those banked, so they're pretty much done. I have a couple of variant covers that I need to get commissioned for them, but otherwise they're lettered and complete, and we have the story all done. So the majority of the work is done. We also have 2 issues of Glow that we're trying to do this year. The 7th issue is in a flat coloring stage, and I need to get covers and codexes done. So I'd say right now it's probably about 70% complete, right? I mean, we still have like a bunch of letters to do and a couple of color revisions, and the lettering process for that comic is pretty extensive because we have like a fictional language, so we have to bounce it between like a linguist and back and forth, and that adds a little bit of various drafts that need to be done. And in the eighth one, we have in thumbnail form. I just got the last thumbnails for it, so it's all thumbnailed out. I need to give some notes on that, and then it's going to inks, and my hope is to get both of those done this year as well. And I'm also publishing another person's project, Dan Lee's Everland. I don't know if you guys saw that project way back in the day. Yeah, so he actually, that was the first project I ever tried to publish back in the day in 2016, and we talked back then, and eventually it just kind of stalled out. But he actually came back to me a couple of months, a year and a half ago at this point now, and was like, hey, I want to relaunch this series. I took like your notes to heart, and like I want to do it with you. So that's kind of cool, and it's been really fun working with him, and definitely like a full circle kind of moment for me. And so those are the comic projects that I'm hoping to get off the ground this year. And beyond that, though, I don't have anything banked. I don't have anything that I'm working on or know what's next after that. I know that, I want to keep doing more issues of Glow. Vince is primarily working on Skies of Fire. We exchange notes on the projects whenever it's in like a draft stage, basically. So we're kind of in the early draft stages of that. And I think primarily what I have struggled with the past couple of years, even though MythWorks has grown quite a bit, is just the time management side of things, and how to do more with less time and more responsibilities. That's been really, really challenging. So one thing that I've done recently, as of this week, is that the first hour of my working day for this past week, only writing, only creative stuff, basically. So I literally, like, I'll go to a coffee shop, I'll get myself a nice coffee, I have a little Panda timer, I'll set it for 60 minutes, and I'll just go. And that has been so good for me, because I don't check emails, I don't go online, nothing. It's just straight into the scripts, and that has been like super, super awesome. And it's quickly become like the most important hour of my day that I have to like protect at all costs. Because what ends up happening if it's not protected is like, I'll start my workday, I'll open up emails, and if I'm not careful, I could just be answering emails until like, 12, 1 p.m. and then kind of be tired or whatever, or God forbid if I have meetings, right? I mean, like if I have a morning meeting, then it sucks. It's just like I take like 2 or 3 meetings, it's like 11, 12, my day's cooked, right? And I think it's not just setting aside the time for me for the creative stuff. It's having the freshness of like the clarity of like my brain working well, and like this is the only thing that I'm focusing on. So hopefully I'm cooking up a couple of other projects, more along the veins of like Skies of Fire and Glow, more sci-fi fantasy stuff, and hopefully they'll be kind of ready to go soon, sometime in the future. But that's mostly it. Like, as the business side of things has grown, making time for the creative side of things, and I'm not talking about like working with artists or art directing and that stuff, which is like tangential, but I think like just the straight up writing process that is like the pure creative process, making time for that has been really, really hard, but I'm trying my best to get back to that and just creating new material, basically.
Yeah, this is something that Curtis and I talk about literally all the time. I mean,
almost every time we're on the phone, yeah.
Almost every time is that, are we spending time writing? Because you're right, the business side of it takes up so much. And like you said, like, okay, I'm launching every month now. I mean, think about what I don't like to use a positive term, just like what a process the fulfillment and running of a Kickstarter and all that business stuff is, right? I mean, I just got comics, and which means I'm going to spend, dozens of hours packing and sending out orders, and all of that just like takes up a lot of bandwidth. And then, I have a day job, and so writing in the morning sounds like a great idea, because you hit on something that I think is like a huge deal, which is that the time of day and like where your brain is at matters. because that morning is sometimes the best time for me. I mean, if I don't write or do something creative before I go to work, by the time I get home, like 2 in the afternoon, I mean, I can get myself to do work, but that's like, I often feel like the best hours of my day are gone, you know? Um, and so that's a huge deal. I think that like daily writing habit.
I like that idea a lot. I might give that a try for a week. I can easily go weeks without like doing any actual comic writing, which is
Curtis
just
doesn't write at all.
I don't write anything, dude. I just launch Kickstarters.
He just designs covers.
Yeah,
That's all he does.
just picking good artists. That's the only trick to it, man. Do you think your experience publishing like RPGs? You said you're publishing your first comic for somebody else. How does that translate into now publishing a comic? Because you're I know you've created some RPGs, some smaller ones, but primarily you're like the publisher of it, right?
Yeah, so I think it does translate maybe in kind of strange or not quite direct ways. So I've thought about this recently because I'm also gearing up to maybe publish my first board game. I've done tabletop role playing games, which are a type of tabletop game, but they're not quite board games, right? And at first, like a couple of years ago, I was like really intimidated by the idea of doing a board game. But in thinking about it, a comic is somewhere between like 22 and like 48 pages, right? And each page is art. So and not just art. Each page is like usually somewhere between 4 and 8 unique pieces of art, right? The various panels. So if you do the math, let's say it's 5, right? 5 panels on average. You got 20 pages. So that's 5 times 20, right? That's like 100 pages of unique pieces of art in a comic, not to mention the various covers that you're doing. For an RPG, for our RPGs, we keep to roughly about a 1-3 or between a 1-3 and a 1-4 art ratio between page count and art. So if it's 300 pages, that means it has 30 pages of 30 pieces of unique art, right? Something like that. 30 to 50 pages of unique art, let's say. And that's pretty typical. So it's actually less demanding in terms of the artistic requirement. And this is, of course, if you're counting every panel as a separate piece of art. And then a board game is even smaller than that. For a board game, let's say you have like 40 cards, right? All right, you have 40 cards, so that's 40 unique pieces of art, plus maybe you have like a manual art, and then you have like a cover art, and that's pretty much it, man. Like that's all it is. So in terms of like art direction, in terms of pure just working with artists and the demands of the artist's labor, comics is easily number one, like far and away. It is the most difficult thing to do, I think, artistically. It's so labor intensive to create a comic, and not just that, but like the workflow for comics is pencils, inks, colors, letters. So and each one might be a different artist. So you have so many people collaborating and touching upon a project, and it's just such a labor intensive process that I think the experience of making comics really gives you a strong fundamental for those other mediums, at least in terms of working with other people, collaborating on stuff, and just sort of like the artistic aspect of it, and certainly the printing aspect, at least from RPGs or comics to RPGs, because you're both printing books essentially. So if you learn one, especially if you get to a trade, especially if you do a hardcover, you pretty much have what you need to do the other. The thing that has been more difficult to translate, or that is a little bit funkier, is the business side of things. So board games and RPGs are just in a much healthier state than comics right now. So it is a lot easier to figure out that stuff once you have product to sell. It's much easier to become like a legitimate company, and what I mean by that is having distribution and selling to game stores and other retail stores and doing wholesale. So that stuff is all possible in RPGs and board games in a way that I think for indie creators is just like not really sustainable right now, or the it's not really possible, and even less so probably with Diamond filing for bankruptcy. What my approach has been, though, now that being said, there are companies that do both. So Diamond is actually the owner of Alliance, and Alliance is the largest board game distributor in the United States. So I think Alliance is their most healthy division of distribution, and the one that they're leveraging for like funds to restructure the rest of the company right now. So they're all owned and operated by different people, though, even though there's some overlap between them. So at least from what I understand, there's Diamond Comics, which services the direct market, the comic book stores. There's Diamond Books, which services like bookstores like Barnes and Noble, as well as some board games and stuff like that, because those places buy games. So they kind of do a little bit of everything. And then there's Alliance, which services just like the hobby game market. So they have 3 different divisions, and there's some overlap, but not really. But my kind of inclination with that stuff, in terms of, taking what I learned, was like, okay, I learned distribution through the RPG side. Maybe then I can get into Diamond Books, who I was talking to. I was telling you about this, Curtis, and I was like in pretty deep conversations to get distributed with them. And I had a meeting with their senior staff, basically, on the Wednesday that Diamond announced like Chapter 11 bankruptcy, right? So like, as it goes with that stuff. But I think a lot of what I've been trying to do is turn MythWorks into like a more legitimate publishing house, like whatever that means. And what that means for a lot of people is having your product in just places that you would normally get stuff, right? Like comic book stores, bookstores, Target, Walmart, whatever. And what I've learned when it comes to that stuff is that the people holding the keys for that stuff, they're the ones who are busting their asses off doing a lot of work every day, because they're the ones looking at spreadsheets, and they're the ones like kind of just moving numbers around endlessly to make the machine work for their companies. And so they're dealing with like, thousands of units of things on a spreadsheet, and that's how like they're looking at things, and it's all about bandwidth for them. That's why they have like kind of those arbitrary things where it's like, well, we want you to have 5 titles because it's not worth our time if you have less than that, because the guy that's handling your account, the sales guy or whatever, he for every company, like he's maybe spending like one hour and maybe less a week on that company, just looking at their stuff, if they're checking up on it at all, right? And it's all the same thing. It shoots out on like the same spreadsheet on the website or whatever. So if you got like one title there, it doesn't really make sense for him. But if you got like 5 or 10, then that's just like kind of populates his list. And you always have to be the one as the publisher to like manage that relationship. Basically, like you got to be the one checking in and be like, hey, are you guys like sold out of stuff, or like, well, how we doing? Because they're not going to be like really looking at that, because like 90% of their business is going to come from like, the top 25% of their clients, basically. So it's really just like a bandwidth thing is what I learned, is that like they can accept you, and like there's multiple ways of like, opening up the conversation with them, right? It's all like kind of the social game of like, you going up to them and being like, hey, what's up, man? Right? Like, can you guys like bring me on board? And like they might kind of throw you a bone or whatever, but it's really about like, can you get enough like heat behind you to open up that conversation? And then once you're in, basically.
So
right?
Speaking of heat, like, because you talked about how comics don't have the same kind of energy behind them right now that like board games and RPGs do. And something that Curtis and I talked about is, you got this review on Quinn from Shut Up and Sit Down has a channel that was like a big deal for you, right? Now, did like in my mind, I want to talk more about that, but because that was something that me, just as a board game fan and a tabletop fan, stumbled into that review, and of course, when I saw it, I was like, oh my god, I know that guy, right? But the thing is, I don't think there's an equivalent of something like that for comics. Like, there's nobody on YouTube or with a social platform who is going to post a review of Sansha and Blanco and be like, this is the best comic that I've read this year, and then all of a sudden your sales are just going to shoot through the roof. Like, that just doesn't exist. And I don't know if that's because of the nature of the hobby or what, but I guess my first question is, did you know that was going to happen? Like, did you engineer that, or did that just happen, that review?
It sort of just happened, but also the way in which we moved about the board game scene, and specifically kind of like the influencer scene, was very intentional. Like, you know, I had Quinn's I had Shut Up and Sit Down on a spreadsheet of like, these are the 6 people that could totally blow us up, basically. And I wrote that list in like 2021 or early 2022, like right when we finished printing The Wild Sea and had got done with Gen Con. And I had, you know, signed my first major deal for distribution. And I was kind of thinking, like my entire head, like every day I was thinking like, all right, how do I sell this thing? How do I get people to pay attention to us? And that was one of the things I did, was like, you know, I sat down and I wrote like, okay, these are 5 people who are YouTube influencers, social media influencers, who, like, if they gave us coverage, they would they could transform our fortunes. And you know, we now today in 2025, all 5 of them have covered us. So like, you know, that has like kind of gone according to plan in some respect, right? Like, and so it's intentional in that way. In terms of the mechanisms of how Quinn's discovered the Wild Sea, that I have no idea. That he reached out to Felix, the game's creator, who told me, and you know, we arranged for, you know, review copies to be sent essentially, and then just sort of he hit the primary correspondence with Felix, and we kind of waited for that to come out. And then it turned out he was also looking at our other game, Slug Blaster, too, and I found out through that creator. And then eventually we connected, and he was like, hey, you're covering a lot of our games. And he used our third game, CBRPNK, for a one-shot, that actual play that he did on his channel too, for Sleeper Citizen, the development crew for that game, which is pretty cool. So like, clearly his taste like aligned with like my taste, like pretty like 1-to-1. So there was a thing there. So I'm not sure how he discovered it, but in terms of like, okay, looking at the scene, and thinking about like, all right, how do I interact with people who are really into this stuff? There was some intentionality behind it, and it came as a mix too. It also like the way that I sort of engaged in like the role playing scene. I learned a lot from my time in the comic industry, and specifically I learned like sort of like, I guess, what not to do. Because early on in my career, early on when we did Skies of Fire and Glow, like right away when I started doing comics, and especially when I did cons, right? Like I was looking around the con scene and I was like, okay, what is this, right? Like, okay, I'm making a little bit of money. I'm not losing money. I'm making money. But on Kickstarter, I can sell a comic for like $15, and I have to sell that same comic for like $5 here. So like, there's this weird disconnect, right, already. And then in looking around at like what everybody was doing, like everybody who was creating comics or like trying to hustle comics at the conventions, people who are like aspiring writers especially, everyone wanted to get to like Image, IDW, Boom, Dark Horse, eventually to like Marvel, DC, right? And that's the pipeline. And once you make it to Marvel and DC, you've made it, right? And you can get like the big boy contracts and whatnot. And then you do your create your own thing with Image and hope that like, you know, you're able to do that or whatnot. And it just didn't seem like it just seemed really crazy to me, because like never talking to people directly about their numbers, but it's like talking to people kind of indirectly about their Image series or their Dark Horse series. If like they went that route first, it's like, wait, how much money are you getting? It's like, wait, I'm already getting that. Like I'm already getting that through
Yeah.
Kickstarter. So it's like, wait, that doesn't make any sense, right? So like there wasn't like a pathway. There wasn't like when I started doing conventions, like I looked around and right away I was like, what's the career path from here, right? Like, okay, I like found some success on Kickstarter and I'm kind of like first gen when it comes to that stuff, but there's nobody beyond like who is in my shoes and who has like sort of moved beyond that, right? And like kind of, and I couldn't just like look to them and be like, what did they do? And like, let me just sort of take that playbook. So that was kind of tough. It was kind of like, you know, I had to invent the playbook a little bit. And like in looking around, I was like, there is no playbook. Like, what do I do, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, and that was really tough. Whereas with like board games and RPGs, it also blew up around the same time, right? Like board games didn't become board games until around 2011, 2012, and it was the same thing. It was like Kickstarter. It was crowdfunding. But the difference is by the time I got into that scene and by the time I got to the conventions, I could look around to like a bunch of different companies like Stonemaier, like Magpie Games, like these companies who had roughly started around the same time I started in comics, maybe like 3, 4, 5 years earlier at the most, but they were now like multi-million-dollar companies. And they had figured out the how to not just have the success on Kickstarter, but to also have like a multi-channel business, right? To engage in the distribution and to engage and get their game out there in the zeitgeist. And plus like that industry as a whole just kind of exploded. And not just that, it's like even if you're not like Stonemaier Games, if you're like, you know, just a moderate success on Kickstarter as a board game, I was looking around at their conventions and like they still have like 3 or 4 full-time employees. Like they're still doing okay for themselves, right? Like they're making a go out of it. Like they can make this thing work. Whereas like that was never the case with comics and crowdfunded comics. And I think there's a couple of things that kind of go into that. Like number one, the unit price of things, right? Like Kickstarter comics, you can still get away with selling a comic for like $15, but you can't really do that at a comic book store. So immediately there was that disconnect, right? So like even worse, you talk about distribution. Now that $15 comic that you have to sell for $5 and not even like $3 at a comic book store, right? $1.50 of that, $1.70 of that has to go to Diamond Comics right away, right? And so like what, you're getting like $1 on every comic, you're getting like 80 cents per comic sold. Like how are you supposed to make that work, right? Whereas with board games, it's like, okay, you're buying a $60 board game, right? And yeah, it's better if the consumer is buying directly from you in crowdfunding, but listen, you go to a wholesaler, you're still selling that thing for $30. You're still selling that thing for $35, $40, right? And like they can make it work, and it's the same price in the board game store as it is on your Kickstarter. So I think that led to way more growth in the board game sector, right?
So yeah, I wanted to talk about board games because so I'm a huge board game person. I've been like obsessed, 15 years. Like I play a lot of board games and a lot of RPGs, and I've always wanted to get into the board game space. What's daunting to me, like you said, the art, I've done the math too on the art. It's like the art, we know how to do art, not that big of a deal, but it's the game design part, because I think the bar for something that people are going to be a fan of in terms of board games is so much higher. There's so much more work involved in terms of design. And because with a comic, if you have a pretty comic that's got an all right story, like you might develop something of a fan base with that where people keep coming back. But with a board game, you have to make something that people are excited about, and then they play and they want to play again, and I think that that to me is so daunting. The only thing I've done so far in that space is I've done 5e supplements that I've been able to make a little bit of money on Kickstarter as like add-ons and stuff like that. And but to me, if you're doing something like a 5e supplement or anything else that's with an existing structure, is you're just playing in a playground. Like I'm not inventing a system of rules. And so maybe you can speak to that more, but it just feels so daunting to be like, all right, from the ground up, I have to build a game that's satisfying to people, and that just feels terrifying to me. And I think that's what's largely kept me from getting into that. And then when you talk about board games, you can't even use the like pre-existing structure of like, here's an RPG and people know what to expect from an RPG. It's like you have to build like a simple system of rules that's satisfying, that can be played within a short amount of time, and that's different from everything else that's out there so far, and that feels like such a huge task. Maybe I've just made a mountain of it in my mind, but it's like the most daunting thing in the world to me.
Yeah, well, like I think for anything, like obviously we didn't get into any of this because we wanted to make a lot of money, right? Like we'd be fools if we were. We got into comics because we love comics, and I think it's the same when it comes to board games and tabletop role playing games. You get into these niche hobbies, these niche art forms, not because you think you're gonna like be a huge success, or you think that the pathway to success is like wide. You do it because you love it so much that you can't see yourself doing anything else. With role-playing games specifically, we had planned to make a Skies of Fire RPG all the way back in like 2015 is when we first started talking about it. It was really quickly after our first Kickstarter, and it was because Joseph Vandal, one of our artists, our cartographer, was also in the tabletop role-playing scene, and he showed us Blades in the Dark back when it was in like Quick Start 5, like beta 5 basically, and he was like, yeah, you gotta check this out. And me having grown up playing these games, playing Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 and Pathfinder, when I read the rules, I was like, wow, this is incredible. This is there is something to this rule set that is different, and I can't quite put my mind around it, but I know that this is sort of like a paradigm shift in the way that I'm thinking about these games, and that's what really excited me about role-playing games. That's why I decided to do role-playing games, and we made that decision all the way back in like 2015, 2016, and it took from that period of time to when we first launched Wildsea basically in 2020, November of 2020. That's how long like I studied role-playing games for, and that's how long I tried to get into it. And what was difficult about it was, number one, Blades in the Dark is a very large game. It's a very complex game. It's a game that if you examine its component pieces, is almost like a clockwork mechanism, and it'll drive you a little bit mad studying that game, because so much of the systems are interlinked. And so I joined a community of hackers for Blades in the Dark, and like it was a bunch of people who were all studying this game simultaneously and like trying to make heads or tails of it, and spending literally years trying to understand like what John Harper did to create this game system. And for a number of years I tried to not just like understand it, but I tried to understand it without playing it, not because I didn't want to play it, but because I couldn't find anybody to play with. Because like trying to find it's a little bit better these days in 2025, but in like 2016, trying to find anybody who wasn't running Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder was like almost impossible. Like I live in Los Angeles, it's a big city, and I swear I like look very hard to find like an open table running these type of games for a number of years, and I just cannot find any. And so I was trying to understand this system while not having played it. And the thing about games that's different is that you don't just write a game. You design a game by playing games. Like that's really play testing is the most important thing. And a lot of designers, especially new designers, try to just like write their way out of it, right? Like I'm designed by writing, but it doesn't work like that, because they're just too complex, and you can get into all the theory crafting in your own head, and you're like, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? Like the fact of the matter is, you won't know until it hits the table and you test it and you break it. So trying to understand a game without like actually playing it was just impossible. So like I like to joke that like I literally spent like especially 2020, I spent most of that year getting a PhD in Blades in the Dark basically is what I like to joke. But that that gave me kind of the grounding and the confidence to the design kind of like news. And even then it's not like I've designed a bunch of games, smaller games and whatnot, and I have a couple bigger games that weren't published, but like, I publish other people's games. But I think that experience gave me the grounding to be like, okay, I think I understand what goes into making these things, and I think I'm able to like navigate my way across that and have a vision and just be confident enough to be able to try and make it in this particular medium. The other thing I will say though is that like just when you have a game, when you have like a role-playing game and you have a board game and it's sitting on your bookshelf, versus like a comic book, like let's say a trade paperback, right? Like let's say it's like one of your favorite like trade paperbacks of all time. Like how many times have you read that thing, right? Maybe like 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, right? And like how long does it take you to read that thing? Even if it's like 300 pages, it probably took you about like an hour and a half to read, right? So like your total experiential time with that graphic novel, even if it's your favorite graphic novel in the world, is probably like 4 or 5 hours at most.
Right.
Versus a role-playing game, one session of a role-playing game is typically 3 to 4 hours long.
Yeah.
If you're the GM, you're spending countless hours preparing it, right? Countless hours reading it, understanding it, referencing it all the time. So like for a 360-page RPG, one that you've played, you're probably looking at like bare minimum, even if you've only played one session, you've probably already spent 15, 20 hours with that thing.
Well, so I wanted to share sort of my experience with this because, so I did the first RPG that I put out. I've obviously what I've done, it pales in comparison to what you've done, but I did a one-shot adventure for Unicorn Vampire Hunter, which is one of my series, and I started the way that you said, which is like you want to try to write your way out of it, and I spent a long time just writing it, and then I did the first playtest, and I was like, I have to like, there was so much work left to do. Like the first playtest just like laid bare how much work there was left to do, and I put more effort into that one shot than any issue, probably any 5 issues of a comic book. And then I've got a friend of mine that I'm working on an RPG project with, and we talked about the art. And even if you go heavy on the art, frankly, the most of the time is put into the game design, because like even if you do more art than the ratio that you said, like there's like to do a big like 300-page book, hundreds of hours at least of time from the designers and people playtesting. I mean, it's a huge commitment. It's a huge amount of time, and it's fun. It's like a fun thing to do, but it's interesting because I think that my experience doing RPGs has made me realize like how good I have it with comics. I mean, I think there's a lot more potential. Like there's a bigger audience for RPGs, but like, comics are like, I know, and maybe it's just a matter of experience. Because, like when you go into a new job and you look at the office or whatever, it's like an alien landscape to you, and after a few weeks, it's like, it's just normal. And, with comics, like I know how to do it. Like it's no longer daunting to me. I'm like, oh, I'm going to start a new series. I know the steps. I have an idea. I'm very practiced in every step of the way. And with something like RPGs or like you're talking about, like getting into board games, I mean, it's like it's such a big learning curve, and there's so much, and you don't know what you don't know, right? It's like you said with writing an RPG, you don't know how much work it takes until you start doing it and playing it. And so I guess my question to you would be like, kind of since you bridged the gap from RPGs to RPGs and now you're looking at board games, like kind of what would, like, do you have advice for tackling something new like that?
Yeah, the advice part's pretty simple. It's just get involved. Like throw yourself into it and find other people, passionate people who who are at your level, but also have like ambition and aspirations. I think that's the best, because then as you kind of go through it, you have like a cohort. And like funny enough, like basically everybody that I've published or am publishing, like I met before while in the trenches, like trying to design games with them, right? And they were all designing their games at the same time, and I was designing games, and that's the how the relationship starts. And that has been like key, I think, because like I'm not just going up to people and being like, hey, I want to publish your game or whatever, right? It's like, no, like you recognize me from Discord or whatever when we're just like talking shop and chopping it up about like mechanics and stuff like that. And it does get easier. I mean, like it's a little funny for me to say, because again, like I've designed games, but I haven't published like certainly the size of games that MythWorks publishes. I've never designed a game of that scope. But you know, in looking at what my designers are doing, especially on their like sophomore projects, and like, you know, just looking at projects like once you have it is definitely like a training, right? It's like now like comics are easier for you, stories sort of easier for you now that you understand what goes into it. And it's the same thing with like these games. It's like once you've done it once, it certainly takes much less time the second go around, the third go around, and you know kind of what to look out for. The funny thing I will say is that when I'm talking to comic people, they ask me about RPGs, right? And they're like, well, how did you do that? And like, what's that like? When I talk to RPG and game people, they ask me about comics, and it's the same thing. It's like, oh, how did you do that? Like, well, what was that like? And it's like, it's really funny. And I guess like it's kind of like a privilege, or like I'm proud of being in like both spaces simultaneously. And that I've definitely kind of seen like learn from that like cross-disciplinary approach of being in both worlds, and like that's really what I'm trying to do with like MythWorks as a whole. Is just like I just want to do all the things I loved as a kid and like love it as an adult, right? And just like have a hand or a foot in like all of these different worlds, and sort of like kind of build things up that way. But yeah, it's just about like it's just about being in the trenches with people who are as ambitious as you are, and at the level you are, so that you know you can relate. And then it's just about the time that you put in, right? What's scary about like I guess going from RPGs to board games, or at least I thought initially, was that I told you about like how much time I spent trying to learn RPGs, right? And like literally hundreds of hours trying to understand this thing. And by the time we finally got there, you know, there's still a huge amount of risk involved in launching these projects or whatever. And I was like, man, that was crazy. And I think that only happened because of COVID. And I don't know if I can do another like genre jump again to do that. But like what I've realized for board games, or what I want to focus on in board games is I always try to do things a little bit different, I guess, in like the various mediums I do. Like, so, you know, my comics are pretty like cinematic. They're like bigger. There's less words in them typically. So they're a little bit like they're not like really like kind of typical like American comics, let's say. RPGs kind of the same way. Like we're on this kind of like indie revolution forefront, and like we're trying to like push these mechanics in this sort of like narrative way, and bring that kind of game more into the mainstream. And then also like just formatting stuff, like, you know, I have big size comics that comic book shops don't like, and I have landscape size RPGs that like board game shops don't like. So I'm always like kind of messing with that stuff. And like I thought about it for like board games, and I was like, you know what, I do really love board games, and I was a huge board game player like 10 years ago, and I had like all the latest releases. Like I'm looking at my shelf, I have like Agricola and the Castles of Burgundy, Pandemic Legacy, you know, Settlers of Catan, Carcassonne, stuff like that. And I was like really into board games then, but at a certain point I kind of got turned off from them because I felt like they were too complicated, and I felt like they were just like getting more and more mechanically heavy, and not just that, but they were becoming more difficult to understand. Like when you first play a modern Euro, you have no idea how you're going to do, because like it seems like the rules are designed in a way where you don't understand what's going on, right? And like you have to play like 3 or 4 times to really know like the most efficient strategy. So with the board game stuff, like my strategy, or like my I guess mentality in guiding us, and I don't know if it's gonna work because we haven't published one yet, but it's like I want to go simple. I want to go like real simple with board games. I want to zag when other people are zigging, right? So I see like the industry, the trend is to go more complex, include more components, have like bigger and more expensive games, and I want like a simple, short game. Basically, is what I want to do.
Are you doing one based off one of your IPs?
No, well, funny enough, I'm looking at one and I want to include it in Glow. So I want to like not just publish it, but also kind of license it for like to include as a diegetic thing in Glow, where it's like this is a board game that they play in the world of Glow. We do have a Skies of Fire board game that we've been working on for in the back burner for a couple of years. So we'll definitely get around to publishing that. So we are looking to do that, right? But the thing is just that like I think ultimately, like, I just care a lot, right? Like, I just want it to be good. I really want the things that we do to be good. And that, like, that sometimes gets in the way, I think, or like, it's hard to let go of control, or to be like, okay, is this, like, am I just going to let someone else do this? And then I'll just like slap my name on it. And like that's really hard for me to do with like the board game scene or whatever. I wish I wish it were that easy, but yeah, like it's something we have thought about licensing and just like going that route. But like if I make a like board game, and if it's like licensed off of like, you know, a comic or another thing that I do, I want it to be good on its own, right? I don't want it just to be like, you know, just because there's fans of one thing that they'll follow me. I want it to be genuinely good is sort of like where I'm coming from.
Oh yeah, for sure. Curtis and I have talked about this, but I think that like adaptations are difficult because, you know, you could get people who are fans of the comic or the IP to come on board with something, but you really want new fans, and so my thought has always been, if I really went deep into RPGs or board games or anything, that it would need to be like new IPs, because I want people to be, you know, feel comfortable, like they're not missing out on something, you know, if they haven't read the comic or whatever. And there's just different mediums, you know. So, but yeah, I mean, so but you're talking we talked a lot about board games and about RPGs. Let's talk about the comic though. Let's talk about comics. And a while ago I said something. Where I said that, you know, that there's no Quinn's who's doing comics that's going to blast you to the stratosphere. So I guess this is almost like me asking who's the liberal Joe Rogan. But what would be what's the comic book Quinn's? Like, what if you could fan cast like a concept for what is that? What does that even look like?
That's really tough, and that's a great question, and I think that amongst comic creator circles, the conversation inevitably seems to evolve into how do we save comics, right? Like how do we fix this thing? Like it's so broken, and like how do we fix things? And it's hard, man, because I think like when I look at comics, especially like the new indie players, I just feel like there's so few people taking risks, and so few people just willing to I guess like expand the horizons of comics, and that's what's like kind of disappointing. Like I look at like every couple of years there's a play where like a former editor of like a Boom or like a Image or Marvel or whatever spins off, gets some like venture capital funding or funding from some source, right? And they're like, yeah, I'm starting my new like publishing company. And like, what do they go do? They hire Warren Ellis. Right? Like that's what they do. Like I'm gonna get Grant Morrison, I'm gonna get Warren Ellis, and I'm gonna get, you know, I don't know, whoever else is out there, right? And I'm gonna hire like the same like 4 or 5 like writer creators who like are awesome, but like we know they're awesome, and we know they're great, and like at this point, like when you do that, you're getting their like the bottom of their slush pile, man. Like you're getting
True.
you're getting like there's like, oh yeah, I got an idea way back, let me bust that out, right? And like especially if it's like a non-creator owned publishing line, it's like if they're willing to like sell it outright, right? It's like, okay, cool, man. And like you're launching this new comic company thinking that like these 5 or 6 creators who have a big name, like they're gonna carry you, and like what ends up happening always is that like they make a big splash that first year, second year, and they release it, and then they just kind of like slowly fizzle out until the next person finds venture capital funding and launches a new thing, right? So
yeah.
like that's like what's tough, man. Like I can't think of like I mean I know there are some really cool creators out there, and I've been a little bit out of touch with like the comic scene, like especially like who's hot right now and whatnot, right? Like for me, what comes up is like I like Ram V stuff. I think he's really good. I like Charles Soule, right? I thought his Genie comic was really really freaking cool. But beyond that, like it's like I haven't like really been keeping up that much. But it seems to me that there's an issue with how talent is broken in the medium, and that's I think like kind of where it starts and ends, and like along with that, the economics of the thing are difficult, because like the only people making like good money in comics are working for the big two, really. And so like if that's the case and you need to break into the big two in order to make comics, then that already pushes the creativity of the medium towards a certain direction. And I thought for a while that like Kickstarter was gonna be like, it's great because we're breaking in new talent and like all these people are trying new creative projects, but I think that's kind of trickled a little bit. Like I see you, Caleb, and what you're doing, and I'm like, yeah, that's freaking awesome, and like he's doing well, he's pushing original comics, and it's great, but there are not enough of like your generation, basically. Like there's not, and I don't see that many people coming after, like I don't see people having success in the $10,000 range that often on Kickstarter.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm barely holding on there, and I think I was part of a cohort that, like, me and Curtis are like basically came up at the same time. He got a break a little bit a couple of years ago, but like it's. I think now, if you're starting on Kickstarter now, it's harder than ever to find that audience and to get it going. But I still see Kickstarter as, right now the most viable platform for that kind of thing, because it's like you said, even when you've got these cool new comic book companies that pop up, Vault, Distillery, Substack was trying to do something for a little while. Like, it's just, you get these big names, and you don't see a lot of people really emerging, like new names emerging from those companies. But Kickstarter, I think you're still seeing, like, people are coming out of it. But I wanted to bring up something you said a while back, which is like, you were looking at Kickstarter and you're like, who's come before me? And where did they go from here? And I don't think that many people really graduate from Kickstarter into, the big two or whatever. Like, there's a few every once in a while, but it's not as though the people who hit it like really huge are just getting snapped up. Like, Marvel's not watching Kickstarter to snap up people who.
I'm still waiting, man.
At least not writers. I mean, that it might happen to artists, but it's not happening to writers, right? But to me, that's not the goal. I mean, I've gone back and forth so much on publishers, and whether I hate them or love them or whatever. But like, to me, I guess maybe naively, I'm hoping that Kickstarter just continues to be the place that I can put stuff out. I mean, I guess the biggest goal would be to do what Stonemaier did, right? Like, Stonemaier essentially like ascended the need for Kickstarter. I mean, yeah, I don't know how much you know about that whole thing. Jamie Stegmaier has written about it a lot, but he doesn't do Kickstarter anymore, right? Because every like once a quarter, he just puts out an email to his email list saying, "Hey, you can pre-order the new game on their website," and they make a ton of money every time.
Yeah. I think part of the answer is like, well, I guess my question to you guys is like, where are you guys talking about comics? Like, where is comic like discussion being engaged? Because I remember like back in the day on Twitter, like there was kind of like the make comics hashtag, right? This was when like Miles was doing like the first couple of issues of After the Gold Rush, and
Yeah,
like
I remember that,
he was really on Twitter, right? And like I remember like there was. I've always been bad at social media, but I remember hopping on there and like people were talking about making comics, right? Like, where did people talk about like making comics these days?
Just on the phone with Caleb. That's about the only
Right.
spot.
I mean, yeah, I'm also bad at social media. I will say it has gotten to be worse and worse over time, but Facebook honestly was the biggest place where I was connecting with other comic book creators, and I still connect with people there, but I mean it's just like all social media, like slowly turning into like a toxic sludge pile of ads that is like not worth anything. And then but the thing about Facebook is it's so open, because you talk about things like Discord, you know, like those kind of communities aren't necessarily
For like meeting new people and just open
yeah.
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think a huge part of that is like that's where it starts, right? Like there's a joke in the RPG world that it's the same 20 people passing around the same $5 to each other, right? Like it's just people passing around buying each other's projects, and they joke about that, but really that's the key, because like the people who are most passionate about something are the ones who want to create the thing, right? Who want to make a career out of it, or want like prosumer hobbyists that want to get into it. And if you look at kind of the comics movements of the past, like you talked about this Kickstarter cohort, right? Like there have been other cohorts like the British Wave, right? Like the Warren Ellis, like Grant Morrison, Mark Millar, like those guys were all like kind of affiliated with each other, right? And it's not a coincidence that so many of them made it from like the same geographic region, right? Because they're all like kind of influencing each other, and when one person kind of makes it big, they can kind of bring opportunities to other people, right? The networking effect. I think of like Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue, Deconic, where they came from Warren Ellis's forum, right? Which is another kind of like cohort where people were talking about making comics, and I think like right now, and we don't have a lot of spaces where that's happening, and where people can kind of share their excitement and their fandom, and maybe like part of it is that stuff has kind of gotten eaten up because like the big two is the only viable thing. So like if you're a comic book fan, like if you go to a comic convention these days, especially the two biggest ones in North America, talk about San Diego Comic-Con and New York Comic-Con, like comics are not anywhere near the most important thing there, right? They're not even like top 10, right? They're like very very they're very low on the totem pole, and like superhero comics have become such a pop culture thing that like it's taken up all of the kind of like oxygen when it comes to comic talk. And I think it starts with the creators and the enthusiasts having a place to talk about comics and to influence and engage each other with their enthusiasm. And I don't see a lot of that right now, and that's where also like the Quins comes into play, right? Like there's a whole ecosystem of like YouTube influencers who looked at what Shut Up and Sit Down pioneered and were like, hey, we can do that, and that became a whole thing, right? Book talk, like TikTok's like book community, right? I think about that and how so much of the publishing world, or like it's had a huge influence on the publishing world now, where it's like, okay, if your book makes it big on Book Talk, that's a way for people to find you, right? And to build up an audience. And like I do see people talking about comics on TikTok, but it's like people hustling their own comics too, right? And there's like a whole creator scene on there now doing TikTok shop comics, which is kind of interesting, and some of them are doing really well for themselves, right? It's like some of them have sold like thousands of copies of a comic and whatnot, but like are those people engaging with one another about like the craft of comics, right? And like I don't see that very often, and I don't see and when that doesn't when that doesn't happen, when that doesn't exist, there's fewer chances of like a cohort coming together and being able to like kind of uplift each other like collectively as a pool. So yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I like here's a shout out to people who are passionate about comics. Like there's so much that needs to get done, right? One thing I will say is that, you know, I started my Substack for MythWorks Comics recently. I know you guys have been at it for a little bit, and like there seems to be a good community on Substack. Like I get this one guy's Substack, what's his name? Like I get his daily emails basically because he's doing like summaries of all the Kickstarter comics going
I saw
up.
that one recently. Yeah, what was his name?
Yeah. I don't know, but I get his emails like every day now. I think there's a thing where like I click on the Substack and it just pops up in my inbox instead of updates, right? So like that's kind of cool. Like yeah, man, like more spaces to talk about comics, to engage in the craft of comics is I think what's like kind of missing. That's a big part of it. I know we have like these small little circles, like our little get-togethers or whatever. And hey, who knows? Maybe they are happening, and maybe they're just like maybe the Marvel and DC writers or the Image writers, they're all hanging out together in like a WhatsApp group or whatever, right? But like, I don't know, man. Like, there's just not a lot of discourse that I see like with comics, along with all of the other issues that like we've kind of touched upon, right? So
yeah,
that's the tough part.
I agree. Was it Kevin Laporte, the Comics Crowd?
Yeah, that guy. Yeah,
I just saw that one yesterday. So you've had a lot of success in RPGs the past couple of years. Why like have the focus back in comics this year? You said you have like 6 comic Kickstarters planned to launch this year. Like what makes you? Are you trying to like chase that success that you had with Skies of Fire, or is it just like love of comics?
No, my friend, I am well beyond that. After a couple of 5,000 comic projects, I am okay with where I'm at, and whatever happens is kind of where I'm at in terms of like success. I think that's good. Like it's for the love of the game, to be honest. It's because I love comics and I want to keep telling stories, and like most importantly for me is like I want to focus on my own stories, right? I've spent the last couple of years helping other people tell their stories and get their projects off the ground, and I found it like really rewarding. And MythWorks, Mythopia formerly, like has grown tons because of it. But ultimately, there's a different type of satisfaction when you're able to get like your stories out. And like even though Sansha and Blanco hasn't been the financial success of the other comics that I've made, like it's I'm really proud of the story. I think this is some of my best writing, genuinely, and like this is a very important story to me.
Yeah, I mean, I thought issue 1 was fantastic. It was really good.
Thank you. And so, like, you know, I want to keep making comics. I want to keep writing, right? I want to, like, I got to remind myself that it's like, yeah, that's why I got into it. It's like, I got into this because I wanted to be a writer, because I wanted to tell my own story. So ultimately, comics is still one of the most accessible ways to tell a story. And I love that. And I think for that reason, like, comics are amazing. You can develop so much in comics that you simply couldn't do in other mediums without millions and millions of dollars. And so I just want to keep making comics, and like part of me, it's almost like a challenge, right? Like, you know, we have these conversations that evolve or devolve into like, how do we fix comics? And I feel like me trying to make more comics is like my way of being like, this is me putting my best foot forward and trying to make it work, and trying to you know, make this thing happen, basically.
Are you guys going to be launching less RPGs with your focus on comics now, or is that going to be like another challenge of like, I struggle with time management, and I'm only making comics and just launching comics myself. You're launching RPGs and comics now, and you said you have 6 planned. Like, are you taking a step back with those RPGs? Or are you still like going full forward with those?
Yeah, not really. We're trying to do the Caleb model, man. We're trying to do like one a month, basically. It helps having a team. That has been like a major focus of like the last let's say like 2 years, really. So the comics, along with the success of it and having different channels, you know, it comes that allows us to add more team members and to handle more. So hopefully that helps a lot. Last year we only did 2 crowdfunding projects. I only did Sansha and Blanco #1, and I did Pico, and that was it. But despite that, we had our best sales year ever, and that was because our Shopify store blew up because of the Quinn's Quest reviews, and not just that, but the Quinn's Quest reviews opened up the way for tabletop distribution as a whole, so we were able to get that up and running. So a lot of that year was spent like getting the infrastructure, like the business infrastructure, up and running for that stuff, which is still like a huge work in progress. Like we have to figure out how to get better at our shipping and all these things, but like we're working on it. And so like part of trying to do more is recognizing that I can't do it all myself, and that like I need to design systems and empower people to do the things that I once did, and be able to train them to do the things that I once, or that I'm doing, and so that frees up my time to be able to do what I'm best at. And I think what I'm best at is like not just writing, but like the development, right? Like the bringing the teams together, the team of artists together, and having people collaborate with each other, and like just shouting to the high heavens that, hey, we're making this thing.
So I have another question. We've been, I don't know how long we plan to talk, but the talking about just being passionate about stories, and we're also talking a lot about business. And one thing that I've run up against is the only way I'm able to keep making as many projects as I do is that even when I take risks, I'm taking very calculated risks, and then if something isn't working, is not doing well enough to be worth continuing to do financially, I have to just stop doing it. There are things that I have either abandoned or put on hold because they're not worth it, and so I think if I was creating a slate of comics 100% purely based on what drives me as a writer, it wouldn't look like completely different from what I'm doing, but it would look different than what I'm doing, because there are certain things that just make money and allow me to keep doing everything else. And some of the stuff that I take risks on, I'm only able to take those risks because the other stuff did well enough that I have wiggle room to be able to try something new. And so I guess, how do you find that balance? Because I assume you can speak to this because you're now doing a project that's really not making money, and but you're very passionate about it. I know you are, because I've read it and it comes through, and the way that you talk about it. So just like, how do you make that decision process?
In one word, poorly. but more seriously, it's tough. It's really tough, and it's something that I guess like I constantly have to balance with Sansha and Blanco. I don't think I would do that project again, like if I were to do it now today, because at the time, like you're right, I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll get like 10 grand on this project, right? Like that was my thinking at the time when making it, and maybe that could have happened if I had just done comics and I didn't do the pivot to RPGs, and my audience was more, I retained more of my audience, right? But I did, and I made all the choices I made in my career thus far. But it is a hard balance, because like we do things for, I do think it's important to do things artistically simply because you're doing it for the art. But obviously, like if you're trying to make a career out of it, you have to balance that and to be able to sustain that. I think that, like, honestly, like, I don't have any magic sauce when it comes to that. Like, I just try to make the things that I want to see out in the world, and I've been fortunate enough in most cases where other people also want to see those things out in the world too. And I think like that maybe is one of the things that I'm like really, really good at sometimes, is being able to like spot trends and trying to and be just like a little bit ahead of the curve. Like when I was a kid, like I love video games, right? But I was never good at them. I was lousy at video games. Even like single player games that other people like would beat easily, I would have a hard time beating them. I was just lousy at games. But the one thing that I was good at was like identifying games that would become popular before they became popular. Like I picked up Counter-Strike like way early, right? And I started playing it like early on in like beta 7 or beta 8 or something like that. And then I picked up like StarCraft really early and stuff like that. So I've always been able to like kind of identify like, okay, this is something that's good, or I think there's something there. And I think that like has guided me in my creative career, especially now in publishing, right? When I'm like looking over stuff and deciding like what stuff I want to publish, like that is able to take me like kind of relatively far. And then the other thing too, to go along with that, is like when you have other channels, that helps mitigate some of the risk, because there is like a floor to sort of the success. And I'm not saying that like Sansha and Blanco will all of a sudden become like a big hit, but the hope is, and what we've seen this with our tabletop games, specifically our small zine projects, is that once you are signed on with a distributor, like of course they're going to be coming for the Wild Seas and the CBRPNKs and the Slug Blasters of the world, because that's what is known and that's like what's viral and popular. But like when they're making their order, they'll just be like, yeah, give me like 10 of Love Balloon 2, or give me like 6 of Pro Patria Mori. So they'll like, once you have a catalog, they'll kind of just like pick proportionally, you know, and in some ways like almost indiscriminately. Like they'll just kind of like go down the line a little bit. Now, to the extent that occurs, we're still kind of exploring. But that is a thing that happens where it allows you to take risks. And then also another thing that I think about, like, you know, I read a lot of like kind of entrepreneurial books or whatever. Peter Thiel has one called like, what is it, Zero to whatever. Peter Thiel, I'm looking it up, Zero to 1, right? And basically the whole thesis of that book is that when you are a Silicon Valley like massive venture capital company, you're looking for unicorns. You're looking for billion-dollar companies, right? So the criteria for a billion-dollar company is very different from the criteria for a $10 million company. So like even though a company is like a $10 million company, they might say it's not worth it to us, right? Even though it's like a profit, because we're looking to hit home runs. They're only looking to hit home runs because a home run is exponentially more profitable than anything else, right? And if you look at like movies, it's the same way, right? Like Avengers Endgame is like, you know, that's a $1 billion movie, right? Like $1 billion funds a whole bunch of $1 million movies, right? So when it comes to like creative stuff and like comics, it's kind of the same way, right? Like even though if you end up having like the Avengers Endgame of comics, or if you end up having like The Walking Dead, right? If you end up having The Walking Dead, you can make 100 Battle Popes no problem, right? Because the one Walking Dead funds all the other like passion projects. And so like kind of thinking about that, or thinking of publishing or like creating stuff in that context, I think helps as well, because it's like, yeah, like the stuff always aggregates towards the top. Like like LeBron James is like the best basketball player in the world, or was, right? Like he's the best basketball player in the world. How much better is he than like the rest of the NBA players? And how much better are NBA players to college players to high school players to average Joe at the YMCA, right? And at each point, the increment is smaller and smaller, yet somehow the difference is more and more, right? Or like he gets paid that much more. He gets paid, $80 million a year versus like the fifth best player who gets paid $40 million a year, right? And it always has that curve where like the top like gets exponentially more than even second, third, fourth, fifth place or whatever. So like in thinking about that, it's like, all right, yeah, you're looking for hits, but if you have one big hit, potentially it can cover for everything else, right? Like having one big hit is worth more than having like 20 medium-sized hits, or
it's
like,
interesting, which is kind of what you had with like the Skies of Fire volumes 1 and 2, and now you can kind of spill that off into other series and stuff.
I think that all three of us, to different degrees of success, I mean, speaking as the person at the bottom of that ladder, but we've all had things that are like within comics specifically, things that are like really big hits, and then things that are less so, and so yeah, and I mean, I think also the other thing is that it's like you said, like those distributors are going to order your other stuff too, and that's what I found with my comics is that even the stuff that didn't do as well when I launched sells through on add-ons on my backer kit surveys like all the time. I did this series that I'm still trying to make happen, kind of called Space Monkey Nights Go. That's a cartoon, a Saturday morning cartoon thing. The Kickstarters for it always do terrible, but it sells through in add-ons really well. And so it's like when people pick up something of yours that they liked, and then they're looking at other stuff that you've done. And you're right. I mean, like if you have something that's more successful, and truly, even at my scale, that's how I've been able to do as many things as I've done, because I have things like my Unicorn Vampire Hunter and Dragon Grit are series that I've done that make more money than I need to continue making them, right? And so I just like, instead of, trying to make smart choices with my money, I dump all that money into other passion projects and then just like keep going. And I assume that's sort of what you're doing with MythWorks, and then things like, Sansha and Blanco is like kind of coasting off of all the success you've had with that.
Yeah, and it's like sunk cost too, right? Like I spent most of the money for Sansha and Blanco. Like I've been working on it since like 2017, so like that money's gone. Like it's been spent. Like and yeah, it's a bummer, but I have I have faith that eventually it's gonna work out, right? Like I think it'll find its audience like eventually, and to your point, like especially going to shows, like the only comic show I do these days, unfortunately, is like San Diego Comic-Con. But like it's always great going to San Diego Comic-Con because like when you do a convention circuit for years and years, you have like true fans, right? And like the true fans are just gonna be like, yo, what's up? What's new this year? All right, cool. Let me grab it, right? Like, and those are like the best fans because they'll gobble it up or whatever, right? And they're just there to support you. So it's always great to have new stuff for them. And I always feel like when I don't have new stuff, I'm like, I'm a little embarrassed. I'm like, ooh, like should have worked harder this year on the comic stuff. But yeah,
I have one last question. One more thing I wanted to talk about, because you and Curtis, I think, both had an experience, if you put the RPG stuff aside, with comics only, took like a long break, right? I mean, we could like drill down and try to figure out the reasons why things work well or don't work well. But I think Curtis and I have both agreed. I mean, I agreed from the beginning, but Curtis has sort of started to accept the fact that taking a long break hurt him. From a Kickstarter perspective, and for me, I like while I've had highs and lows, but I've kept like trucking through. Like I just keep putting stuff out, and I think that makes a big difference. Do you think that taking that long break it has had an impact on how well your comics are doing?
Oh yeah, 100%. Like there's no doubt in my mind. There's no doubt in my mind. I do wonder like if I had just gone straight into Sansha and Blanco from like Skies of Fire, right? And not just that, but even like Skies of Fire filling that project, it was like I was trying to juggle that with producing like 3 RPG projects at the same time, right? And that definitely slowed me down when it came to that stuff. And just trying to juggle all of these various balls in the air. I think the number one thing is communication, and certainly taking a break falls under that communication category, right? So yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot, and I think about like I even with like Glow, right? Like I probably, I don't know, we'll see how number 7 does, but like I wish I could get like 50 grand on a single issue, right? That'd be really nice. And there's like a handful of creators that can do that, and those creators are like pretty consistent, right? They're doing like 2 or 3 a year consistently. So I do think taking a break really hurt me. And I think it's just in general, it's like, they want to see productivity. They want to see you progress, and they want you to communicate that because they're kind of fans of you as creators and like, or the creation of the project, like first and foremost, if they're on Kickstarter, right? It's not just about the thing that they get. It's about the experience they get backing you with the updates and all of that stuff. So yeah, I think if you're able to sustain it like you have been, Caleb, like that's like the best. I think that's the way to do it if you can, right? And I think as the platform has matured, that's the way things are going too, which is kind of interesting. Like Tom Ankle and Rocket Ship, like I look at like what they're doing and how many projects they have going on all the time, right? And it's like, okay, it's almost like this professionalization of the genre or the industry. Oh, I think we lost Curtis.
We lost Curtis.
But yeah, I think it hurt me. I think it certainly hurt me a little bit. And I wish that, like, in hindsight, would I have done things differently? I don't know. It's tough to say, right? Because like I think ultimately, like I try to do as much as I could, and like I could only do what I was able to do. And like yeah, and the only thing that I can do now going forward is to like try to make more stuff, right? And try to get it out as consistently as possible. But definitely, I think it hurt me.
Well, yeah, I mean, so much of it too is comics, like RPGs, team effort, right? You have all these people involved, unless you're one of the rare unicorns that does the whole thing top to bottom by yourself, and so that has to be coordinated, and there's a lot of communication just within those teams that's required. Part of the reason I had a series that was doing very well and had to go on almost 2-year hiatus because I just didn't super communicate well. I made some assumptions about what the artist was going to be able to do or not do, and he took on a big project that paid more money than I could pay and had to not draw anything for me for a year. And it was a great thing for him to do, but it's just that's me being like, oh, of course he's just going to keep drawing my thing because I'm the most important person in the world, and that's just going to keep happening. And so I think it just it's hard to coordinate that, and that's like a whole skill set in itself. Like you said, the whole business side of it is just learning those things. And I know Curtis can speak to having an artist become a big deal and then going and taking on other projects, and that delays his stuff.
Oh yeah, it's happened a lot with a couple artists.
Yeah,
I know. Isn't that annoying? It's like as the writer producers of the project, it's like those annoying editors will always go to your team first, but never like you.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten the opportunity to pitch. They'll usually like at least accept a pitch from me, and then usually ghost me, and then I see my artist doing like a couple new series with them, and it always sucks. I mean, like you said, Kickstarter is still a spot for indie creators. I mean, I have a couple of Dark Horse releases now, and the money I've made on Kickstarter like outweighs the money I've gotten from Dark Horse by a ton. So it just makes sense to still just Kickstarters to primarily focus. And I don't know, it's always insightful talking to you. You're kind of like a class ahead of me and Caleb, like we were saying. So it's like, at least we can look to you and see what you're doing. You might not have anybody to like look to and follow, but we can kind of follow you. And like, I feel like you're taking the right steps and like focusing on Kickstarter and like kind of doing your own like publishing house and stuff.
Yeah, thanks guys. I appreciate it. And it's good to see that like there are people, it's good to see like ultimately like comics is we just all want comics to grow, right? Like that's I think everybody who's in comics shares that. And that's like what I want to see, and I think Kickstarter is still like a great way to get your work out there to break in new talent. And I just want more people to make comics and comics to grow, and I want there to be more discussion about making comics and people enthusiastic about comics. And hopefully us doing this podcast and all of that is like one small step in that direction.
Totally.
Anything else to add about Sansha Blanco? I know it's live for like 11 more days.
Yeah, I mean, just check it out. I think it's a really good series. The put my heart and soul into it. The story is good. It'll unfold. It gets better and better. It is a great project about dogs. Technically, I was ahead of all the the dog comics. I just didn't get it released in time, But like seeing all those dogs, I was like, oh man, missed the boat.
I was actually going to ask you that. I know that you said you had like the first 4 issues done. Was the delay in kickstarting it is just because you guys were like so into RPGs at the time and you had to get those like stuff that you already had out, those partnerships and stuff?
Yeah, pretty much, man. It's just there's only so much that you can do, right? Like, and especially when you're a two-man show, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just figuring out how to get on top of things and get more of a cycle going with releasing books.
Right.
I mean, here's the thing. I'll tell you that my secret, not that you're asking for my secret, but my secret is be stressed all the time, basically never sleep, always be mad at yourself for not being more productive. It's really great. It's a great system. So.
I'll take your word for it, man. But I think I'm getting there too, man. Like I'm definitely getting there in terms of like the stress and beating myself up over being unproductive.
I mean,
yeah.
your writing thing though. I think Curtis and I both need to do that. Is put some time into writing every morning. I mean, that's so huge.
First thing tomorrow morning, dude. You already know. I'm gonna stick with it.
I'm gonna call Curtis tomorrow afternoon and be like, "Did you write this morning?" He'd be like, "Yeah, totally. I totally did."
Yeah,
I wrote 3 emails to new variant artists. Got some sick designs coming down the pipeline.
You already know it's coming. Your Substack, is that like your main comic mailing list now?
That is, yeah. It's more kind of like behind the scenes stuff, updates as to like, here's the progress of things and here are my thoughts on like comics and what I'm reading and stuff like that.
Okay, cool. Check out Ray and MythWorks. It's at MythWorks on like most social media, right?
Yep, MythWorks HQ on social media, myth.works our website, MythWorks Substack, mythworks.substack.com, I think, for the mailing list.
Okay. And then Sansha and Blanco issues 1 and 2 on Kickstarter now. You got the next 2 issues coming later this year. I think that's it for this one.
All right.
Radio.
Thanks for coming on.